The halls of the Red Keep reeked of blood and fire. Jaime Lannister, his golden armor splattered with crimson, stood amidst the corpses of men who had once sworn loyalty to House Targaryen. The battle was over. The war was lost. King Aerys lay dead at his feet, his skull split open by Jaime's own blade. The rush of killing the Mad King was fading, replaced by something far more insidious: dread. He had broken his vows, slain the man he was sworn to protect. He knew what came next. Tywin Lannister's forces were ransacking the city, carrying out his father's will with ruthless efficiency. Gregor Clegane and Amory Lorch had been sent to the royal nursery. Elia Martell and her children were next. Jaime hesitated only a moment before he turned on his heel and sprinted through the burning halls. He had seen enough butchery this night. He would not allow it to happen again. The nursery was in chaos. A nursemaid cowered in the corner, shielding little Rhaenys beneath her skirts. Elia Martell stood in the center of the room, clutching Egan to her chest, her dark eyes wide with terror as Gregor Clegane loomed before her. The Mountain had already drawn his blade. His grotesque face twisted into a sneer as he reached for the infant prince. Jaime moved before he could think. His sword flashed in the firelight. The Mountain barely had time to react before Jaime's blade struck true, slicing across his exposed neck in a precise, practiced motion. Blood erupted from the wound as Gregor staggered back, hands clutching at his throat. He gurgled, eyes bulging, before crashing to the floor with a sickening thud. Amory Lorch, who had been standing by the door, lunged at Jaime in fury. But the Kingslayer was faster. With one swift movement, he drove his sword into Lorch's gut, twisting it deep before pulling it free. The man collapsed beside Clegane, gasping for air that would never come. The room was silent except for the crackling fire and the whimpers of terrified children. Jaime turned to Elia, his breath heavy. "We need to leave." "Now." Elia stared at him, frozen in shock. Why did you do that?" Jaime had no answer. He didn't know why. He only knew that he had spent his entire life following orders, doing what was expected of him, and for once, he had chosen to act on his own. Footsteps echoed down the hall. More Lannister men were coming. If they found him here, standing over the bodies of Tywin's assassins, with Elia and her children still alive, there would be no explaining it away. Jaime grabbed Elia's arm, his grip firm but not unkind. "There's no time. If you want to live, come with me." Elia hesitated only a moment before nodding. She clutched Aegon tighter, while Rhaenys clung to her nursemaid. Jaime led them out into the night, knowing there was no turning back. The Red Keep was a maze of fire and death. Jaime knew the halls better than most, but navigating them with Elia Martell and her children in tow made the escape all the more difficult. Every corridor was thick with smoke, the screams of the dying echoing through the castle like a funeral song. The scent of blood and burning flesh filled the air, but Jaime pushed forward. Elia clutched baby Aegon tightly, her face pale and streaked with sweat. Rhaenys clung to the nursemaid's skirts, too frightened to make a sound. The little girl had seen the corpses of her protectors, the bloodied halls where her father once walked. Jaime knew that no matter what happened next, she would never forget this night. A group of Lannister soldiers rounded the corner ahead, their crimson cloaks fluttering like banners of doom. Their leader, a burly man with a notched sword, recognized Jaime instantly. His eyes flickered to the woman and children behind him. "Ser Jaime?" The soldier's voice was uncertain. Jaime stepped forward, blood still dripping from his blade. "The Mountain and Lorch are dead. I took care of them." He let the weight of his name settle in the air before adding, "Lord Tywin's orders." The soldier hesitated. "Your father sent them to wipe out the Targaryen bloodline." "And I did," Jaime interrupted coldly. He turned slightly, angling his body to block Elia and the children from view. "Tell Lord Tywin it's done." The man stared at him, clearly uneasy, but after a tense moment, he nodded. "As you say, sir." With a final glance at the bloodied corpses behind them, the soldiers turned and disappeared down another corridor. Jaime let out a slow breath. They had bought themselves time, but not much. Elia was shaking. "You lied," she whispered. Jaime turned to her. "I just saved your life. Do you want to argue or do you want to survive?" Elia swallowed hard and nodded. She was a Martell, proud, intelligent, but not foolish. She knew they had little choice but to trust him. Jaime led them down a hidden servant's passage, a narrow stairway that descended into the lower levels of the Red Keep. If they could reach the stables, they could escape into the city before Tywin realized what had happened. As they descended, Elia finally broke the silence. "Why are you doing this?" Jaime didn't stop. "Because I don't want to be the man my father made me." Elia didn't press him further. By the time they reached the stables, the streets of King's Landing were in chaos. Tywin's men were pillaging, looting, killing. The city burned under the weight of conquest. Jaime pulled a dark cloak over his armor, grabbed 2 horses and helped Elia onto one. The nursemaid took Rhaenys in her arms, and Jaime pulled Aegon close to his chest, covering the infant in his own cloak. "We ride for the gates," Jaime said. "Stay close, stay quiet." With that, they disappeared into the night. The streets of King's Landing were a nightmare. The cries of the dying filled the air as Lannister soldiers tore through homes and butchered those who dared to resist. Fire spread unchecked, painting the sky in hues of orange and black. The stench of smoke and death clung to everything. Jaime urged his horse forward, gripping Aegon tightly beneath his cloak. He could hear Elia and Rhaenys just behind him, their horses' hooves clattering against the cobblestone streets. They had one chance: escape before Tywin realized the truth. The city gates loomed ahead, guarded by Lannister men. Jaime pulled his hood lower, his grip tightening on the reins. He needed to be careful. If the guards recognized him, everything would be lost. He rode up to them, his voice sharp. "Orders from Lord Tywin. Open the gate." One of the guards stepped forward, squinting. His eyes flickered toward the cloaked figures behind Jaime. "Who are they?" Jaime's hand rested on the hilt of his sword. "Prisoners," he lied smoothly. "Lord Tywin wants them taken to the dungeons quietly. Now open the gate." The guard hesitated. Jaime could see the doubt in his eyes, the way his fingers twitched toward his spear. But no one questioned Tywin Lannister's orders, not if they wanted to live. After a long moment, the guard gave a curt nod and gestured to the men on the wall. The great iron gate groaned as it slowly opened, revealing the dark road beyond. Jaime wasted no time. He spurred his horse forward, the others following close behind. The moment they crossed the threshold, he knew there was no turning back. They rode hard into the night, putting as much distance between themselves and King's Landing as possible. Hours passed in silence, the only sound the steady thudding of hooves against dirt. Finally, when they were far enough from the city, Jaime pulled his horse to a stop. The others followed, panting from exhaustion. Elia dismounted, clutching Aegon as she turned to Jaime, her dark eyes unreadable. "Where do we go now?" Jaime took a breath. There was only one answer. "Dorne." Elia flinched. You think my brother will welcome a Lannister into Sunspear? Jaime met her gaze. Oberyn will do what is best for you and the children, and right now that means trusting me. She studied him for a long moment before nodding. Then we ride for Dorne. Jaime mounted his horse again, his heart pounding. Tywin would realize his betrayal soon. Perhaps he already had. When that happened, all of Westeros would turn against him. But none of that mattered. For the first time in his life, Jaime Lannister had made a choice, and he would see it through to the end. The journey to Dorne was long and perilous. Jaime, Elia, and the children avoided main roads, keeping to the shadows as they moved south. Every town they passed carried the risk of discovery. Jaime's golden hair, even beneath a hood, was too well known. If Tywin's men caught wind of them, they would be hunted like animals. They slept in abandoned farmsteads, ate whatever they could steal or buy discreetly. Jaime kept his sword close at all times, watching the roads behind them for any sign of pursuit. He knew his father well. Tywin would not tolerate this betrayal. The moment he realized what Jaime had done, he would unleash hell upon them. Elia was quiet most of the journey. She rarely spoke unless necessary, her grip on Aegon never loosening. Rhaenys, only a little girl, asked questions Jaime didn't know how to answer. "Where's my father?" she had whispered one night, curled up beside her nursemaid. "Where is Grandfather Aerys?" Elia had not answered. Jaime hadn't either. By the time they reached the outskirts of the Red Mountains, they were exhausted. Dorne was close now. If they could just make it past the border, they would be safe. But safety was an illusion. One evening, as they made camp beneath the rocky cliffs, Jaime spotted something in the distance. A line of riders approaching fast. His blood turned to ice. They had been found. Jaime's hand went to his sword. "Get on the horses," he ordered. "Now." Elia's eyes widened. "Who is it?" Jaime didn't answer. He already knew. The crimson and gold banners of House Lannister fluttered in the wind. Tywin had sent his men. They rode hard, pushing their exhausted horses to their limits. But the Lannister riders were fresh, gaining with every passing second. Jaime clenched his jaw. He had to buy them time. "Take the children and ride ahead," he said to Elia. "Go to Sunspear. Oberyn will protect you." Elia shook her head. "You can't fight them alone." Jaime pulled his horse to a stop, turning to face her. "I have to." He met her gaze, his expression unyielding. "Go." Elia hesitated, then gave a sharp nod. She didn't waste another second. With a flick of the reins, she and the nursemaid rode off, disappearing into the mountains. Jaime turned back to face the approaching riders. He drew his sword, the weight of it familiar in his grip. His father's men slowed as they neared, their leader stepping forward. "Sir Jaime," the man said, "your father demands your return." Jaime tightened his grip. "My father demands many things." The soldier sighed. "You know we can't let them escape." Jaime smirked, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Then I suppose we have a problem." The men hesitated, shifting uneasily. None of them wanted to be the one to fight Tywin Lannister's heir, but duty outweighed fear. The first man lunged. Jaime met him with steel. Steel clashed against steel in the fading light of dusk. Jaime moved like a shadow, his sword an extension of his body. The first Lannister soldier was dead before he hit the ground, blood spilling onto the rocky terrain. The others hesitated for only a moment before they closed in. Jaime was outnumbered, but he had one advantage. None of these men were his equal with a blade. He ducked a wild swing, driving his sword through the gut of the second man. The third tried to flank him, but Jaime spun, cutting deep into his thigh before finishing him with a quick thrust to the throat. The leader of the group remained, gripping his sword tightly. He had seen what Jaime could do. "Sir Jaime," the man said, his voice tight, "this is madness. Your father will never forgive you." Jaime smirked, wiping blood from his blade. "That's the idea." The man charged. He was skilled, but Jaime was better. Their swords met in a flurry of sparks, but Jaime could see the openings. A feint to the left, a pivot, and then his sword sank deep into the man's chest. The soldier gasped, eyes wide with shock, before Jaime shoved him off his blade. The battlefield was silent now, littered with the dead. Jaime took a deep breath, wiping sweat and blood from his face. He had won, but he had no time to celebrate. He turned his horse south and rode hard, praying that Elia and the children had made it to safety. Hours passed before he reached the Will River, the natural border between the Dornish marches and Dorne. As he approached the crossing, a group of Dornish riders emerged from the shadows, their spears glinting in the moonlight. Jaime pulled his horse to a stop. He was surrounded. A rider stepped forward, his dark eyes full of suspicion and fury. "Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper of Dorne." Oberyn studied him with a look of pure hatred. "Jaime Lannister," he said coldly, "give me one reason I shouldn't kill you where you stand." Jaime held up his hands. "Because I saved your sister and her children." Oberyn's expression didn't change, but his grip on his spear tightened. "And why should I believe a Lannister?" Before Jaime could answer, a soft voice called from behind the riders. "Oberyn!" Elia Martell stepped forward, Aegon in her arms, Rhianni clutching her cloak. She was alive. Oberyn's breath hitched as he took in the sight of his sister and her children, unharmed. He dismounted in an instant, rushing toward them. Elia let out a trembling breath as Oberyn embraced her, then turned to Rhaenys and Aegon, his expression unreadable. Jaime sat still, watching. He had done what he set out to do. Oberyn finally turned back to Jaime, his eyes sharp. "You betrayed your own house for them." Jaime nodded. The Red Viper studied him for a long moment before exhaling. "Then you are under the protection of House Martell." Jaime let out a slow breath. He had made it, but he knew this was far from over. Tywin Lannister would not forget this betrayal. War was coming. The sun rose over Sunspear, casting golden light upon the domes and towers of the Martell stronghold. Jaime stood on the balcony of the palace, gazing at the sea. It was a strange thing. He had grown up surrounded by gold and power, yet here in Dorne, surrounded by those who should have been his enemies, he felt something close to peace. But peace would not last. Elia and her children had been safely received by Prince Doran Martell, who had wept at the sight of his sister alive. Rhaenys clung to her uncle Oberyn, while Aegon, too young to understand what had happened, cooed in his mother's arms. Sunspear was a haven for now. Jaime, however, was not so welcome. Dorne had been measured but cold. "You saved my sister, and for that you have our gratitude," he had said upon their arrival. "But you are still a Lannister, and your father will not sit idle." Jaime knew it was true. Tywin would retaliate. He was not the kind of man to let betrayal go unpunished. If Jaime had any doubts, they were erased the moment a rider from King's Landing arrived at Sunspear's gates, carrying a scroll with the Lannister seal. Doran unrolled the parchment with careful hands. Jaime watched from his place in the hall, Oberyn standing at his sister's side. The silence was heavy as Doran read the message. Then slowly he lifted his gaze to Jaime. "You should hear this." Doran's voice was even, but Jaime could hear the steel beneath it. He cleared his throat and read aloud. To Prince Doran Martell, you harbor a traitor and thieves. You shelter a man who has forsaken his house, his family, and his oaths. Know that this will not stand. You will return my son to me at once, along with the children of Rhaegar Targaryen, or you will face the wrath of House Lannister and its allies. Consider this your only warning. Lord Tywin Lannister, Warden of the West, Hand of the King. The hall fell into silence. Jaime exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He had expected this, but hearing the words made it real. Tywin would not hesitate to send an army to Sunspear, and if Robert Baratheon backed him, war was inevitable. Elia stiffened. He calls my children thieves, as if they were mere objects he could claim. Oberyn let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Tywin is a man who sees everything as a game of power. He never cared about you, Elia, and he never will. His gaze flickered to Jaime. Your father wants you back. Will you go? Jaime met his gaze steadily. Number? Oberyn smirked. Good answer. Doran sighed, folding the letter. We must be careful. Dorne is strong, but we cannot stand alone against the Seven Kingdoms. He turned to Jaime. Your father will try to turn Robert Baratheon against us. We need to act before he does. Jaime nodded, already knowing what needed to be done. We have one advantage, he said. Robert hates the Targaryens, but he despises Tywin almost as much. If we can get to Robert first, Doran raised an eyebrow. You would go to Robert yourself? Jaime hesitated. Robert Baratheon had once been his friend. Before the war, before the rebellion had twisted everything. Would Robert listen? Or would he see only a Lannister traitor? It's a risk, Jaime admitted, but if we can convince him that keeping Aegon alive is in his interest, Tywin's plans fall apart. Oberyn leaned forward, intrigued. And how do you plan to convince the man who built his throne on the bodies of dead Targaryens? Jaime smirked. By telling him the truth. Jaime rode north under the weight of 1,000 uncertainties. The Dornish sun had barely begun to rise when he set out, accompanied only by Oberyn Martell and a small escort of Dornish spearmen. They had debated for hours. Doran had argued that sending anyone to Robert Baratheon was a fool's errand, that no king who had built his throne on Targaryen blood would ever spare Rhaegar's son. But Jaime had insisted. Robert was not Tywin. He was brutal, vengeful, and short-tempered. But he was also once a man who had called Jaime brother. There was a chance, perhaps a small one, that he could be reasoned with. And if that failed, well, Jaime had no illusions about his fate. The journey to King's Landing took a fortnight, and by the time they arrived, the city was on edge. The streets were crowded with Lannister banners, gold cloaks patrolled with an aggression Jaime hadn't seen even during Aerys's reign. Tywin had taken full control. Jaime and Oberyn dismounted before the Red Keep's towering gates, their escort waiting behind them. The guards tensed at the sight of them. Jaime, the traitor, and Oberyn, the Viper of Dorne. We are here to see the king, Jaime declared. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. One of them hesitated before nodding and disappearing inside. Oberyn smirked, adjusting the grip on his spear. I can feel the fear in the air, he murmured. It seems your father has been busy. Jaime didn't respond. His heart was pounding harder than he would have liked. Minutes later, the gates creaked open. A messenger returned, looking as if he'd swallowed poison. The king will see you, he said stiffly, but Lord Tywin has ordered. I don't take orders from my father, Jaime cut in sharply. Lead the way. They were escorted through the keep, the atmosphere thick with tension. The halls of the Red Keep were different now. Tywin had stripped the walls of any remnants of the Targaryens. Even the dragon skulls that once lined the halls had been removed, replaced with banners of the stag and lion. When they entered the throne room, Jaime's breath caught at the sight before him. Robert Baratheon slouched on the Iron Throne, his massive frame drowning in furs and silk. He was not the warrior Jaime remembered. He was heavier now, a man accustomed to excess. His face was flushed from drink, but his sharp blue eyes still burned with the fire of the usurper. Beside him stood Jon Arryn, his hand resting thoughtfully on his cane. And near the edge of the room, watching like a predator, stood Tywin Lannister. Jaime met his father's gaze, unflinching. Tywin's expression was unreadable, but Jaime knew him well enough to sense the fury behind that calm exterior. "Well, well," Robert rumbled, his voice thick with amusement, "the Kingslayer returns, and with a martell at his side, no less. This ought to be interesting." Jaime took a breath. "I didn't come to play games, Robert. I came to tell you the truth." Robert raised an eyebrow. "Oh? And what truth is that?" Jaime stepped forward. "Aegon Targaryen is alive." The room fell into a stunned silence. Jon Arryn's eyes widened slightly. Tywin's jaw tensed. Robert, however, simply stared at Jaime, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he let out a deep laugh. "Aegon is dead," he said. "Gregor Clegane smashed his head against the wall. I saw what was left of him." Jaime shook his head. "You saw what my father wanted you to see." He glanced at Tywin then, his voice turning colder. "He ordered the death of Elia Martell and her children to ensure your claim was undisputed. But I stopped it." Robert's amusement faded. "You're telling me you've been hiding Rhaegar's whelp all this time?" "No," Jaime said. "I took him to Dorne. He's under the protection of House Martell." Robert's grip on the armrest tightened. His knuckles turned white. "And why should I care?" Oberyn finally spoke. "Because he is the rightful heir, Robert," he said smoothly. "And if you kill him now, you will only prove that you are no better than the man you overthrew." Robert's eyes darkened. He stood abruptly, descending the steps of the throne, with surprising grace for a man of his size. He loomed over Jaime, the smell of ale and sweat clinging to him. "I should have known you'd turn traitor," he snarled. "You always were your father's dog." Jaime smirked. "And yet, here I am, defying him." Robert's breathing was heavy, his hands clenched into fists. "And what do you expect me to do? Spare him? Let him grow into another dragon to challenge my reign?" Jaime met his gaze unwavering. "I expect you to be better than my father." Silence stretched between them. Jon Arryn finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Perhaps there is another way, Your Grace." Robert didn't look away from Jaime. "And what way would that be?" "Aegon is a child. He poses no immediate threat," Jon said. "Instead of killing him, we could ensure his loyalty." Robert scoffed. "And how do you propose we do that?" Oberyn smirked. "By binding him to your house." Robert frowned. Then realization dawned in his eyes. "You mean a marriage?" Oberyn nodded. "You have a daughter, do you not?" Robert hesitated. "Myrcella." Jaime felt his pulse quicken. He hadn't expected this turn, but Oberyn was right. A marriage alliance could end this conflict before it started. Aegon would remain in Dorne, but his future would be tied to the Baratheon dynasty. Robert rubbed his beard, considering. Finally, he turned to Tywin. "What do you think of this, Lord Tywin?" Tywin's face remained unreadable, but Jaime could see the barely contained fury in his eyes. He had lost. Finally, Tywin spoke, his voice measured. It is a practical solution. Robert grunted. He turned back to Jaime. If I agree to this, I want your word, Jaime. No more betrayals. Jaime met his gaze. You have my word. Robert studied him for a long moment before exhaling sharply. Fine. The boy lives. But if he ever raises a banner against me, I'll kill him myself. Jaime nodded. Fair enough. Oberyn smirked. A wise choice, Your Grace. Robert grumbled, but waved a hand. Get out of my sight before I change my mind. Jaime turned on his heel, Oberyn following beside him. As they walked past Tywin, Jaime paused just long enough to meet his father's gaze. For the first time in his life, Jaime had won against Tywin Lannister. And gods, it felt good. The deal was struck, but peace in Westeros was always an illusion. Jaime and Oberyn rode south, the Red Keep fading behind them, but neither man spoke. Even with Robert's agreement, they both knew that war still loomed on the horizon. Tywin Lannister did not forgive betrayals, and no Lannister, not even Jaime, escaped his wrath unscathed. By the time they reached Sunspear, the news had already arrived ahead of them. Doran Martell sat in his solar, his expression unreadable as Oberyn relayed the terms of the agreement. Elia sat beside him, her hand protectively cradling baby Aegon. Rhaenys clung to her mother's side, her dark eyes filled with confusion. A marriage, Doran finally said, his voice slow and thoughtful. Oberyn smirked. A Baratheon princess for a Targaryen prince. A poetic twist, no? Elia's lips tightened. You truly believe Robert Baratheon will honor this agreement? Jaime exhaled. For now, yes. But I won't lie to you. This peace is fragile. If Aegon grows to be anything like his father, Robert will see him as a threat. And if Myrcella is mistreated in Dorne, the Baratheons will retaliate. He glanced at Doran. This alliance must be real, or it will fall apart. Doran tapped his fingers against the armrest of his chair, deep in thought. Aegon will be raised in Dorne, he said finally, but he will not grow up as some pawn. If war comes, he will be ready. Jaime nodded. That was all he could ask for. Elia, however, remained stiff. And what of your father, Jaime? Jaime swallowed. Tywin is humiliated, but he won't strike openly. Not yet. Oberyn's smirk darkened. No, but the old lion will find another way to bare his fangs. They all knew it was true. Tywin did not suffer defeat. If he could not kill Aegon outright, he would find another means to remove him from the board. Perhaps poison, a political maneuver, or a future betrayal. He had been outplayed this time, but the game was not over. Doran finally stood. Then we must prepare. We will accept this peace for now, but we will not trust it blindly. He turned to Jaime. And you, Kingslayer? Jaime met his gaze. I am no longer a Kingslayer, and I am no longer Tywin's son. Oberyn chuckled. Then what are you? Jaime hesitated. He had spent his life defined by his father, by his name, by the stain of Aerys's death. But here now, he was something else. I suppose I'll find out. Doran nodded approvingly. Then welcome to Dorne, Sir Jaime. Far to the north, in the halls of Casterly Rock, Tywin Lannister sat alone in his chamber, the letter from King's Landing crumpled in his fist. His son had betrayed him. His name had been disgraced, and the Targaryen boy still lived, but this was not the end. Slowly, Tywin unrolled a fresh piece of parchment and dipped his quill into ink. If brute force could not remove the boy, then politics would. He began to write. To House Frey, House Hightower, and the Bank of Bravos. The game was not over. It was only beginning. Thank you for following this alternate history. Would you like a sequel exploring how Tywin retaliates? Or should we explore another what-if scenario?